Alright, so I am back again with yet another camera to review, and if you watched my previous video you recognize this. It is a Brumburger, which is not really a camera company, but a company that used to exist in New York that sold a lot of photo supplies and sort of like movie supplies. I think they also had a catalog where they sold some toys, and they purchased some cameras and had them rebranded with their naming. And this one, if you look at it, you can see a couple of hints. There's a 2S right here. Can you see that? There you go. And you'll see it has a Neoca lens, kind of an interesting name. And if you look right here, it says Neoca around the little ring that lets you select the shutter speed. And that's kind of the key. This is actually a Neoca 2S or S2, depending on who you ask. And Brumburger bought a number of these. Who knows how many? I would probably estimate somewhere around like 2,000, maybe less. And they had them rebranded with their naming and sold them through their catalog. I actually found some ads that show this camera. Usually it's sold as part of a set where it has the camera, a leather case, which I also have, a little fold-up flash, which I also have, and then some sort of projector type thing, like a 35mm slide projector, which I don't have and frankly don't really want. But it's a pretty interesting little camera. It is kind of a budget camera for its time, so it's lacking in some features, but it does pretty good with what it has. You have, of course, a nice little viewfinder. It's kind of small, but it does work. It has a nice rangefinder, high contrast, and it seems pretty accurate. You have a 45mm f3.5 azimuth lens with a leaf shutter, maximum shutter speed of 1/300th of a second. Unfortunately with mine, the lower shutter speeds all seem to be broken, but the 1/25th, 1/50th, 100th, and 1/300th of a second all work, as well as the bulb function, which I'll probably never use, but you do have some of those options. There are things, like I said, that are a little weird and quirky, like it has a double stroke film advance, and granted I think it's one stroke advances the film and one actually cocks the shutter, but it's kind of interesting because you can watch this little mechanism up here. There's sort of a pin and a little claw, and you see them traverse and they go back, and then it snaps back when you hit the shutter, and I think that's kind of neat. Unfortunately there are some little gaps around that and on the bottom where there's the sort of slow timer mechanism, which works but hangs up quite a bit. You can kind of see it going, but it's a little rough and needs a little help to get going. Actually, it's not doing very well at all, but you get the idea. And I think the gaps probably let some dust in there, and that's probably why it's having some issues. So if I open it up, I can probably clean it and fix it. But I said the same thing about the Voigtlander, and that didn't really happen. So I think I'll hold my tongue on that one for now. There are some little things that are a little on the cheap side. Like if you feel it, it's very lightweight. I think it's made out of tin or aluminum for the most part, whereas most cameras from this time frame were probably made out of brass from what I've seen. So it doesn't really feel cheap, but it does feel lighter than average. But you look at certain things like the shoe mount up here. Normally there's some sort of pressure plates to kind of hold in something like an external viewfinder, which you wouldn't really need on this camera since there's only one built-in lens, or a meter, which you would need because there's no meter. So if you do want to mount a meter on here, you're probably gonna have to put some tape on the bottom to like hold it on there so it doesn't fall off when you're walking around with it. You have some other weird things, like you have this lens hood. I leave this on at all times because it has sort of a clamshelling on it, and that makes it very easy to focus the lens. And if you don't have it on there, there's just not a lot to grab onto, so you have to grab the nose of the lens, and you have this little tab that's supposed to help, but it feels like it gets in the way. And I'll hit the little self-timer mechanism down here a lot, which then of course kind of throws off your shooting because you're like, wait, what's happening? Oh, the thing's going. All right, let's let that run out. Okay, it's still going. It's still going. So as you can imagine, that gets kind of annoying. So I don't know. I could always remove that if I really wanted, but then again, I don't know if I'm really tempted to open up this camera. It has another feature I wasn't a big fan of. You have the little hinge right here that opens up the film back, pops open nice and easy. You can see inside. Nothing too amazing. Pretty standard stuff. But when you go to shut it, it doesn't snap automatically. There's not a I don't know what it is, some sort of spring in there. You have to actually manually push that little tab up to seal the back and make sure the film's in there nice and light tight. One of those little things that it's not the end of the world, but that's, as far as I recall, this is the only camera I've seen that has one of these hinges where it's completely manual and it doesn't have some sort of lockback mechanism. So it does kind of show that it was a bit of a cheaper camera, but it works pretty well. And it has an interesting feature, and this is one of the things that kind of caught my eye. If you've watched my channel for a while, you'll remember I have one big complaint about rangefinders in general and Nikon's you know, pretty broadly because that's most of what I own. And that's that they don't have a very close focusing. They usually max out or minimum out at around 3 feet, which gets the job done most of the time, but it's not perfect. But with this camera, you can actually go all the way down to 1.7 feet, a little beyond it actually. Probably not quite 1.6, but you know, you're getting close to 1.5 feet. That's pretty close, and especially for a rangefinder and an older camera, that's really impressive. You don't see that too often, so I put that to use with some of the shots I took, and I went out and I took quite a few shots of this camera. I put about 2 rolls through it that I've developed, and I think they came out pretty good. I used Arista EDU 400, developed in sort of a D76 developer, not an actual Kodak developer. It was the ultrafine photo warehouse variant, which I imagine is very similar. And I think I got pretty good results. I was surprised that the contrast was better than I would have expected. A lot of times with older lenses like this, the contrast isn't great because they were kind of meant to shoot black and white and color at the same time, and they weren't really honed for either one. And from what I read, this is a lens with a lot of coatings. I believe it's multi-coated, and I think it had some special, fairly unique coating for its time. So I was not expecting great black and white results, but I got nice, pretty high contrast black and white results, and I think it looked very good. The close focusing worked really well. Even the viewfinder, I didn't really have a lot of parallax issues using it relatively close. I mean, granted, I might not remember the exact framing I had in my mind a week or two later when I developed the film, but it didn't seem to be unusable like you might expect with an old rangefinder like this. And I think I got pretty good results. I would like to try it with color film. That's something I have not done. From what I read about it, I think it would probably work pretty well with color film, and I might arguably get better results with color film, but I don't know if I'd really hold my breath on it. I do wish the slower shutter speeds worked. I'm kind of a perfectionist, so it irks me they don't work even though I would never use them. So I might try to open it up and fix it, but as I previously said, I feel like that's probably tempting fate a little bit. So pretty interesting little camera right here. And there were a lot of other Neoca cameras made. Some of them, like the Model 1 and 3, are surprisingly similar to this Model 2 here. And the later ones take an interesting cue where they look a lot like Nikon rangefinders. But they are pretty interesting, and I wouldn't mind picking up one of the later ones because if you find an S5 or one that I think is called like a Super S, they often have a Zenno lens on them, which is a pretty renowned lens company from Japan around the same time. And I would love to have one of their lenses, but they're kind of rare and they usually cost a lot of money, and that seems to be the most affordable way to get their lenses. And interestingly, this was not the only Brumburger camera. A couple of years later, they had a Royal camera from the Royal Camera Company. I want to say it was either it must have been a 35C or a 35P, which again looks a bit like this, but it has sort of a single action advance lever and a much bigger viewfinder. And I think some of them even had faster f2.8 lenses, but a very similar lens design. And they made some of those with the Brumburger branding, and those actually have a much nicer script that looks kind of like it's written in cursive. And I wouldn't mind picking those up. They're not terribly expensive, but they are kind of rare. I don't think Brumburger had more than 2,000 of either of these cameras made. I could be wrong. It could have been 5,000, but still, in the greater scheme of things, they're relatively rare, and you just don't see them around much, and there doesn't seem to be much demand for them, which is kind of sad. I understand they're not like super high-end cameras. They're kind of limited in what they do, but I feel like these old cameras with the leaf shutter and the really simple shutter speed mechanisms are probably going to be the ones that are still working like decades and decades from now. I know people say, oh, it's going to be Leicas and this and that, and you know, maybe if you have somebody to constantly service them, but I think it's cameras like this, like these old Japanese leaf shutter fixed lens rangefinders and American versions like the Argus C3 specifically. I think those are going to be the cameras that are sitting around somehow still working 80, maybe 100 years from now. So I can't say I have necessarily super high hopes for this camera, but I wouldn't be shocked if in the long run it does kind of outlive me in some way or another. So hope you enjoyed that. Here's a bunch of photos I took with the camera. Hope you like those, and leave a comment. Tell me if you know anything about this camera or the company. And by company, I mean either the Neoca camera company in Japan or the Brumburger camera company in New York. I guess they weren't a camera company, but a photo supply company. I don't know much about either of them, and especially with Brumburger, you can find some of their old catalogs, but there's very little information other than the address of where their building used to be and the actual catalogs. So if anybody knows anything, please leave a comment. I'd be really interested to know. And thanks for watching. I'll be back again with some other weird camera or lens at some point. So stay tuned until then.